one finger off, and that red paint had run all over everything, looked like blood. And all the kids thought he cut his finger off. He'd throw that finger away, and afterwards the kids would look all over trying to find it. And then they'd want to see his hand. He'd pull off his glove and show them his hand, and the finger was gone all right. Been gone for 15 years. They never could figure it out. One kid says you can only do 4 more shows. And people would ask you the stupidest questions. If you parked the car along the street, they'd have skull and crossbones and devil's heads and stuff painted all over it. And they'd come up and be staring at that thing. They'd see you and say, "Were you ever killed?"
And what would they say?
They'd say, "Well, 3 times," and then I got kind of tired of it. And the clowns would go up in the grandstand and walk behind the row of seats. And a lot of guys in the summer wore straw hats, you know. They'd walk behind them. They'd grab a hat in each hand and put it on the guy next, see? They'd walk down that line of people, and they all had somebody else's hat just in nothing flat. It'd take a while to sort that out.
Can we talk a bit about Lucky Lot?
Well, there were 2 of the Lot brothers, Willard and Lucky. Willard was the younger one, and they were both with Lynch for a while. Willard couldn't see much. He was practically blind, and he always wanted to be a driver. He'd come in for the ramps, he'd straddle them. He couldn't see them well enough to run over him. He was always mashing stuff up. And Willard saw himself as a producer. He was always trying to dream up stunts, most of which were not practical or too far-fetched or too expensive, but he kept on trying. And when he had his own show, he would try those stunts, no matter what they cost. He would try them.
What kind of things that you remember?
Oh, like running into a brick wall 5 feet high. He'd make the wall with mortar made with glycerin instead of water. And glycerin won't get hard. So it was the same thing as hitting an ordinary wall as soon as you lay it, before the mortar sets up. Now that took a lot of work and quite a bit of money, and it was only that high. It wasn't too much to look at. But that's typical of the kind of things he was always doing.
And would Lucky Lot come up with any stunts?
Lucky wasn't that busy trying to dream up stuff. He was more practical than Willard was.
Could you tell me about the stunt he did on wires? Was it on wires?
I didn't see that. I just saw a picture.
Oh, could you describe it?
Well, they took 2 cables, about 5/8 diameter steel cables, and attached one end to the grandstand roof, brought the other end down about middle ways of the racetrack to a big iron stake. And they staked that cable out. They had turnbuckles in it to tighten them, and they got a motor crane and lifted a 4-door Plymouth up on top of the grandstand with the tires removed. They had the wheels on the car, but no tires. And then one of them, I don't remember which, drove that car down those cables. Never thought about it falling off, I guess. It could very easily.
Drove it off of...
Drove it down the roof and down the cables to the ground.
During a show?
Yeah, it was part of the show.
And so the grandstands were...
They drove right over a grandstand full of people.
I guess they only did that once.
I think. But the picture I saw was taken when the car was right about in the middle of the run. Everybody was leaning back, looking up. The car was about 20 feet in the air above them.
When you first met Lucky Lot, I was with the Lynch show,
Yeah,
and he was just setting up ramps. And
yeah, ramp hand.
were you around when they started letting him do stunts for the Lynch show?
Oh, everybody more or less got in on the act sometime or other. You couldn't have one guy be the big star. There'd be too much chance of something happened to him, and you couldn't make the next show. You want everybody to be able to do something besides their own job.
Did Lucky...
It didn't take anything to do those ramps, Dale. All you had to do was do what Tom Stevens told you and watch the flag
Which flag?
that the track foreman had, showing you whether to come or stop or what.
Oh, for moving the ramps.
No. Controlling the car. In other words, if that red flag came up, that car stopped, no matter what. He may not know the reason. He doesn't need to know the reason. He just needs to get stopped because there's trouble. See, with the Lynch show, you had to have discipline. But as long as you had a green flag, you could go. And if Tom had told you to go 40 miles an hour, well, you went 40 miles an hour over the ramp and it came out beautiful. The car jumped where it was supposed to and kept on going. You had control. But if you started diddling with the brakes or whipping the wheel back and forth, hard to tell what had happened to you.
All of the guys Lucky Lot included, they enjoyed it.
Beg your pardon?
Did they enjoy it?
Ooh, Lucky Lot?
Yeah.
Well, I suppose they hung around long enough.
When did Lynch stop performing?
When the Japanese got into Manchuria, into Indochina, or as they call it now, what's Vietnam? What country is that?
Vietnam?
Yeah, what country is it in? Well, I guess that's the name of the country.
Yes.
When they got in there, that's where tires were coming from. Everything stopped.
Did he enlist?
There couldn't get tires, you couldn't run.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody could buy a tire without a ration tag.
Why didn't Lynch start up again after the war?
Well, cars went from rigid axle to knee action to coil spring suspension on the front which was very much weaker than a solid axle. And the cars became lighter. And for example, the four-door sedans were not nearly as strong as the 38 or 40s. If you banged them around, they'd fold up on you like a wet accordion. It just put a limit on everything. You couldn't roll over a car 57 shows like we used to.
They weren't tough enough?
They weren't tough enough. Parts cost more, cars cost more. Everything was more expensive and not as strong. Even lumber to build the ramps and everything cost more. Since lumber was rationed, they used up most of the good lumber on ration tickets before they got started processing more. For a long time, the sawmills were all shut down. And you couldn't do those things with green lumber, as they found out.
Yeah. You and Lucky and yourself roomed together?
No, I never roomed with Lucky.
Oh, I thought you were roommates at one point.
Oh, you mean Lucky Lot?
Lucky Lot.
Oh, we might have roomed together a week or two somewhere. More than likely.
When you were on the road, did you always stay in hotels?
No, we sometimes stayed in tourist homes. There were still some around then.
What was that, like a bed and breakfast?
Well, that's what they call them nowadays, but they used to call them tourist homes. Somebody had a big house with a lot of rooms. They'd rent you a room. A lot of times that was very preferable to any hotel you could find. More comfortable and cleaner and more fun.
And better food?
Well, you didn't often eat there. Very seldom. Sometimes you'd get a piece of toast and a cup of coffee, about it.
How's your drink?
Huh?
How's your water?
Oh, it should be all right. One time during the winter, we were just putting on free street shows. We'd go in a little town no bigger than Belleville and put on a street show. I had a sound car, and we had a truck to all the ramps, and we had a tool truck and a couple of stunt cars, and we made a tour through the South and put on a free show right on the street. Sometimes that got a little interesting, especially if they tore a brake hose off the jump car. Then they'd hit the sound car to get stopped, because that belonged to us. If I had somebody in there with me and I saw that brake hose fly off a wheel, I'd reach over and grab the guy by the front of the shirt and I'd yell in his ear, "Stay in here." I didn't want him releasing the door latch, because I knew we were going to get hit and he didn't. I'd kick it in neutral and release the brake. and let it roll backward when he hit it. That absorbed the impact. It scared the heck out of the guy with me, but didn't hurt much. He busted up a few radiator grills.
Was that one of the sound cars that you built?
Yeah.
Tell me a bit about that, like how that got started.
Well, you couldn't rent good sound equipment of the kind we needed, because in a racetrack that had no power lines, you couldn't have an amplifier running on batteries big enough to shoot sound through that motor noise with the mufflers off and everything, and you didn't have power enough if you had a fire or one to call an ambulance or something. You just didn't have the horses. And to get the horses, you had to have line power. So I took farm lighting plants, built them in the trunk of the car. I had a 7-cylinder Plymouth. And we'd have that power plant running. That gave us 500 to 1,000 watts. We could run the amplifier all we wanted. And we built big